Hi folks. This mini lecture is going to give you a basic overview of the gross anatomy of the endocrine system, what the glands are, where they are, and what hormones they produce. That will also be true for the fourth installment of this series. So remember, endocrine glands are made of modified epithelial tissue, modified for secretion of particular substances, and those substances are released directly into the bloodstream rather than into a duct, a lumen and then a duct, as with an exocrine gland. The endocrine glands essentially touch every aspect of our lives, hence the exclamation point after homeostasis. And they partner with the nervous system in ensuring homeostasis of the body. But unlike the nervous system, the response is slower and more prolonged. Okay, so here are the major glands. Please, 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 for your next exam and for the final, be able to identify what each of these glands are. You're also going to want to be familiar with what the hormones are that each gland produces and what the target tissues are. So we're going to start with the hypothalamus, which we've already briefly talked about. And which is right in here. It's almost impossible to see in this. And go all the way through the gonads. So we're going to go top to bottom. All right, so the hypothalamus, which remember is hypo to the thalamus. It's under the thalamus. So if the thalamus is in this area, what's coloring over what's red in these diagrams is the hypothalamus. This is an anterior view of the brain and brain stem, and this is a lateral view. So these two functions are coordinated with one another, but they use different mechanisms. So we've got a nervous function where the internal environment of the body is regulated through the autonomic nervous system, right? So monitoring heartbeat, body temperature, water balance, those sorts of things. And then the endocrine system, which secretes hormones. The hypothalamus is considered to be part of the nervous system and the endocrine system. It is a neuroendocrine organ. And this particular structure, the hypothalamus, is seen as the bridge that allows communication between the nervous and endocrine systems proper. So we're now looking at a mid-sagittal section through the brain. Right, you've got the nasal cavity here. Oops, different color. Nasal cavity here, oral cavity here, and cerebellum. Right, with the brain stem here. The thalamus is labeled, right? And then the hypothalamus is shown in blue. And the easiest way to recognize the hypothalamus is that it has sort of a sideways W shape to it when you're looking at it in sagittal section. Right at the base of the hypothalamus, when you cut the brain right down the midline, and separating left and right, is what's referred to as the optic chiasm. That's the location where the nerves from our eyes, the optic nerves, cross before heading to the occipital cortex, well, to the thalamus, and then the occipital cortex. And hanging off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which is the master gland. So again, right, this is an MRI through that same close-up portion of the brain. We have the corpus callosum here, which you guys will remember is that big bridge of axons between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. And you can clearly see that W shape, right? So let's see, I'll do this. There's the hypothalamus. Then we've got the optic chiasm right here, and the pituitary gland. So there's the stalk, and there's the front of the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, and there's the posterior pituitary, which is lighting up in this person, showing that there's a problem there. So the hypothalamus regulates what in most endocrinology textbooks is referred to as the 4 F's: fighting, feeding, fleeing, and mating. I just always have to show this to you guys because it cracks me up that this is actually in college textbooks, but there you go. Okay, so how is it that the hypothalamus is capable of, such a tiny structure is capable of touching so many different parts of our behavior and our functioning? And the answer has to do with how the hypothalamus communicates with the rest of the body. So in this image, the hypothalamus, oops, that's not really blue. Here we go. The hypothalamus is shown as blue, and the hypothalamus secretes hormones that are called releasing hormones, and that makes the pituitary gland, which is yellow instead of red. Pituitary gland releases a second set of hormones that stimulate or inhibit the action of a third set of glands, like the thyroid or the adrenals or a gonad like the testis. So this is just showing you that in the same idea in a more graphic form. So you have the hypothalamus that secretes a releasing hormone. The releasing hormone acts on the pituitary gland and causes it to release a stimulating hormone or an inhibiting hormone, but at this level we're just focused on the stimulating hormones. And that makes a third gland. I'm just calling it gland X here because there are a bunch of them. Gland X secretes a third hormone, and that's that third hormone that actually acts on the target tissue. Circulating levels of the third hormone have a negative feedback effect on secretion of stimulating hormone as well as on the releasing hormone. Right, so remember, if you have homeostasis, the major mechanism is going to be negative feedback where the response counteracts the original stimulus. So if the original stimulus for the hypothalamus to release releasing hormone is low blood hormone levels, then once those levels go up, that's going to inhibit the hypothalamus. One thing I want to point out to you guys before we get into any more detail about hormones is that there is a difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary in terms of how they function and what hormones they create. And so it's important to be able to tell which is which. And the easiest way to do that is to look for the presence of the optic chiasm, right? Because optic refers to eyes. Your eyes are in the front of your head. And so that means that whichever lobe of the pituitary that is closest in a sagittal section is closest to the optic chiasm is going to be the anterior. And the other is going to be the posterior lobe. This question all the way over on the left, what bone is this? That, my friends, would be the sphenoid. And the sphenoid has that lovely little pocket that allows for protection of the pituitary gland. Okay, so the pituitary is called the master gland because it regulates a lot of other glands. Right, if we look at the picture, again, we've got the hypothalamus here. We have the stalk of the pituitary, which is called the infundibulum, and then the anterior and posterior pituitary sitting in the little spot that the sphenoid has made, and then we've got the optic chiasm here. So the pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus by this stalk called the infundibulum, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. It only weighs about as much as a paperclip. It's really tiny, the size of a pea, and yet you cannot live without it. If you need to, you're going to be taking lots of different kinds of replacement hormones for the rest of your life. Okay, so posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland does not make any of its own hormones. Does not make hormones. It does, however, store hormones, two different hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus and transferred to the pituitary through the hypothalamic pituitary tract, which is a bridge of axons that runs through the infundibulum, the pituitary stalk. Right, there's our friend the optic chiasm, so we know that we are actually looking at the posterior pituitary here. So again, the posterior pituitary does not make any of its own hormones. The hormones that it secretes, that it releases, are from specialized neurons in the hypothalamus called neurosecretory cells. So those two hormones are antidiuretic hormone, which you've heard about before in the context of the urinary system, and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone is released from the posterior pituitary when the hypothalamus detects that blood has become more concentrated. right? So lower levels of water, higher levels of solute and cells. So the posterior pituitary releases antidiuretic hormone, and that has a number of effects. It acts in the nephron to close the aquaporin channels that allow water to flow into the tubules and forces the urine to become more concentrated because of that. It also results in increased thirst, which is handy since if you're dehydrated, you need to drink more water.
What happens in your body when you start getting dehydrated? Water levels in the blood decrease, and this is detected by receptors on cells in the hypothalamus. These receptors are called osmoreceptors. In response, the cells secrete the signalling molecule antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. ADH is a hydrophilic peptide hormone. The ADH is released from the pituitary and travels in the blood to the kidneys, where urine is produced. Nephrons in the kidney filter urea, salts and other solutes out of the blood. The last part of the nephron, the collecting duct, is the final place the body can reabsorb water. ADH receptors are located on cells lining the collecting duct. ADH binding to its receptor triggers a cascade of interactions between molecules inside the cell. This process is called signal transduction. It activates vesicles containing water channels called aquaporins. These are inserted into the plasma membrane. More water can now move from the collecting duct back into the blood. Because of ADH, less water ends up in the urine, and the urine becomes more concentrated. So if you are dehydrated, ADH helps you to conserve water by decreasing your urine production.
Oxytocin is involved in two different kinds of positive feedback loops. It is responsible for uterine contractions during childbirth, and you can look back at the information from the homeostasis lecture about how that process works. It also is involved in milk letdown, the milk letdown reflex during nursing, where the initial stimulus is the baby suckling. That leads to release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary that was made in the hypothalamus. And that leads to ejection. Oxytocin leads to smooth muscle contraction in the ducts of the breast and ejection of milk. Next, we're going to talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland and their targets. So the anterior pituitary gland is closer to the optic chiasm, which is how we know it's anterior, and it has a different kind of organization than the posterior pituitary does, which you can see here. So there are groups of cells in the hypothalamus, groups of neurons that have axons that project down toward the anterior pituitary, but they actually don't secrete their hormones in the anterior pituitary. They release them into a set of capillaries that are wrapped around the infundibulum, the stalk of the pituitary gland. So remember, we talked about the hepatic portal system that carries blood from the digestive tract through the liver before it goes into general circulation. This is a similar kind of thing. A portal blood vessel system is a restricted circulation. So the anterior pituitary secretes 7 different hormones in response to releasing factors or hormones from the hypothalamus, and 4 of the 7 actually then act on other glands. So we're going to start with prolactin, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and growth hormone, and then we'll talk about the others that have a different sort of a pattern. So prolactin, which is usually abbreviated PRL, all caps, stimulates the mammary glands to develop and to enlarge during pregnancy and are involved in milk production as opposed to milk letdown. That's oxytocin after childbirth. 2 ways you can tell that this is the anterior pituitary. First, you've got the optic chiasm, and second, you have the axons from the hypothalamus that are ending on the portal blood vessels. All right, melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So remember from the integumentary system that melanocytes are cells that are in the epidermis of skin, and they are crazy looking cells. They almost look like neurons. They have these processes that sort of thread through and in between other cells in the epidermis, and they produce this protein called melanin, which is responsible for skin color. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone stimulates the melanocytes in skin to produce melanin, and their activity is upregulated after we're exposed to the sun. And they release these little granules of melanin, which then become distributed throughout the epidermis. So it provides a wider level of protection for the nuclei of cells than if it didn't release the granules. Growth hormone is responsible for stimulating and growth and also maintaining growth. It's released from the pituitary gland, and its targets are muscle, bone, cartilage. Don't worry about this part down here. It's AP2 level stuff. If you have super high levels of growth hormone in a developing animal, like a child, you end up with gigantism. If you have much less than normal, you end up with what's referred to as pituitary dwarfism. This is very different than other kinds of dwarfism, because the little person's body actually has the standard proportions, unlike with achondroplastic dwarfism. If you end up with a condition that leads to overproduction of growth hormone in an adult, you develop a condition called acromegaly. I have a hard time saying that one. And although, the epiphyseal, the growth plates have sealed, you just have the epiphyseal line at this point, but you still have active areas of cartilage in many places in the body, particularly the face, hands, and feet. This is an example from quite a long time ago of a woman with a pituitary tumor, anterior pituitary tumor, that led to increased growth hormone secretion. So this is before symptoms, and then this is after 17 years. So any areas where there's a fair amount of connective tissue that's still capable of expanding, hands, feet, face, you're going to end up with growth there. Now, 4 of the 7 pituitary hormones, anterior pituitary hormones, have effects on other glands. And there's this sort of general pattern, which illustrated over here, where you have the hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone that acts on the anterior pituitary and generates, which then releases a stimulating hormone, which acts on a third gland and causes it to release hormones, which acts on a target tissue. This is usually referred to as the hypothalamic pituitary gland x-axis. For 4 of the 7 anterior pituitary hormones, there is a pattern where the hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release a stimulating hormone, which then stimulates a third gland, either the adrenal cortex, the thyroid, testes, or ovaries, to release a third hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone, produced by anterior pituitary in response to thyroid releasing hormone, stimulates the thyroid gland to make triiodothyronine, which is T3, or thyroxine, which is T4. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is activated by corticotropin releasing hormone, and it stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Adrenocorticotropic hormone seems like a serious mouthful, but remember that cortex means bark, so we're talking about the outer layer of the adrenal gland, and the word tropic means change. So it's the hormone that changes the response of the adrenal cortex. Then we have 2 gonadotropin hormones. So remember, tropin means change. You know what gonads are. So these are hormones that change the response of the gonads. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle production in females, which leads to egg maturation. Follicle stimulating hormone also acts in the testis to facilitate sperm formation. Luteinizing hormone acts on the testes and the ovaries as well. It is involved in ovulation in women and in testosterone production in men. Both of these are stimulated in complex ways by gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is coming from the hypothalamus.